Hi y'all, and welcome back to my channel. And welcome to another sort of introspective discussion, listening to my opinions sort of video. I know that I've been doing a lot of these recently, but this has been sort of kind of my escape and kind of one of the things that I do when I like to escape, when I like to, I don't know, do things that bring me peace, is I like talking. I like discussing things, you know. For me, one thing that gives me joy is getting a bit more introspective and sort of sharing my thoughts with people. And so as much as my channel is about providing y'all with sassy rhetoric and makeup opinions, it's also a place for me to be able to feel comfortable, to be able to express my opinions and thoughts with y'all, whether you agree or not. And I did have one person, I believe, I can't remember which video it was, I think it was an anti-haul, which I had been posting pretty freaking regularly. During the holidays, that shiz is always kind of back to back to back. But they did make a comment that was kind of like, oh, well, your stuff has seemed kind of repetitive and negative, you need to do something else. Which I do understand. There had been a lot of, like I said, sassy anti-haul rhetoric. I was like, you know, makeup that sucked, makeup that no one cared about, you know, that sort of thing. But one thing that people kind of have to understand, this is gonna sound absolutely awful, but most of y'all probably know that YouTube thrives off of negativity and controversy and clickbait. In order to actually get a significant amount of views on my video, if you go back and look, and if you go and look at the ones that are like, 10 best palettes, or, you know, my favorite thus and such, and then you look at them compared to anti-hauls and videos that are more kind of negative and controversial, you'll see there's a pretty big gauge difference between the positive and the negative. I'm not saying that I'm trying to I'll always have negative content, but for someone where this here is my only source of income, I know how much I can make in a month, and to a certain degree, I have to create content that will maintain that amount because I have bills and responsibilities. So I do apologize if things have seemed particularly negative or nitpicky or anything like that. It's just kind of the struggle balance between creating overly whatever fluff content and creating, you know, critical negative content. I just kind of wanted to let you all know that there is a lot more that goes on with this channel and creating content and sustaining it than kind of just what you see on me filming and everything like that. So I hope that cleared up at least something, put it out onto the table. You know, I'm not at a subscriber count, or I'm not at a view count. That's my big thing. I got 16.2 thousand subscribers, and I'm lucky if I can break 3,000 views on a video. So where I am financially, I cannot afford to reach a lower amount of income than I know what I can make, and I cannot afford to miss an upload as well. So I just wanted to let y'all know that, and that's kind of the reasoning behind. I mean, I love creating my critical analyzation, whatever content, but because, you know, there was a little bit kind of like, oh, why are you doing so much of it? I did kind of want to kind of just address it a little bit. But today we are going to be having a sort of look at the palettes of eyeshadows past. Because I've been on this platform for a fair amount of time. My physical flesh prison has made its routine journey around the sun 30 times. I've been on the platform for a bit, and so I have seen some eyeshadow palettes come and go, comparing to the eyeshadow palettes that when I started, what were end-all be-all must-have to haves, that are maybe now sort of by the way, are things that aren't as lusted after, or things that have kind of succumbed to their age. Obviously, this is just me being introspective, retrospective, hyperbolic. I'm not putting a stamp of whatever on these palettes. If they are palettes, which I know A lot of them are tried and true. And if it is a palette that you absolutely love, that is fan-tucking-fastic. You keep doing you, boo-boo. But I'm just talking about them sort of in a case of makeup history, just sort of analyzing what it was when they were hot as to why they aren't necessarily held in the same high esteem as they were 4, 5, 6 years ago. So we're just gonna go right in on this. So we're gonna start off with one palette, very, very near and dear to my heart, the Urban Decay Electric Palette, which Urban Decay decided it was a good idea to discontinue it. And not only did they do that, they then, a couple years later, decided, well, they're whining, they're complaining, they want a crazy Vivid Brights palette from us. We're gonna give them the Wired palette, which comparatively in quality and color story was just kind of a mistake. And so we had the Urban Decay Electric palette, which at one point in the makeup whatevers was the high-end mainstream bright eyeshadow palette to have. It was the first high-end eyeshadow palette that I ever bought. I remember going to Sephora with my friend Cameron, and I was like, I'm gonna buy one shiz here, and I bought that shiz, and that was the gateway drug into all the rest of the makeup. And so for me and my absolute crazy color-loving heart, y'all know I took that blue shade and just put it all around my lid. That palette was also so freaking good for special effects makeup and coloring eyebrows. The fact that it's discontinued makes me so angry. And it's kind of like, it was a pretty significant staple. I feel like when watching collection videos and declutters and favorite palettes, a lot of people talked about this palette. It was sort of a must-have for color lovers. I don't think it was necessarily a must-have for a beauty YouTuber person, but for people who loved colors, this was kind of a need to have in their collection. Obviously, I don't have a hold of Urban Decay's sale records or anything like that, so I don't know if sales on that palette just dipped too low that they could not afford to keep making it, and that's why they discontinued it. But I mean, I'm not entirely sure if I think that the need or the desire for purchasing brights had gone down so much that they needed to discontinue it. I feel like if they brought it back, some people would repurchase it. I probably would if they promised, swore on the Bible, and just all like whatever, that the rebrought palette was the exact same formula, then I'd buy it. But if you think about then, when the Naked palette was like originally released, it was originally the end-all be-all color palette to have, whereas you look at the makeup market, even the mainstream makeup market now, there is so many colorful palettes. I mean, Urban Decay did the electric palette at the time. They were the go-to for color, for vivid, for bright, for purple, pink, blue, green. They were the brand to go for because they were the ones doing it. Whereas now you can get color from, we've got Huda Beauty. You know, if we're just talking about like high-end situation, we've got Huda Beauty, we've got Natasha Denona, we've got Violet Voss. There is a plethora of mainstream makeup brands that are now doing color as a normal thing. It's easily accessible. I sort of talked about this in the palettes we used to need to have, talking about the KVD Mi Vida Loca remix, where it's like, oh, that color story. Whereas if it were released now, it'd be like, oh, okay. You know, there just wasn't that lack. There wasn't that hole in the industry that was being filled with colors by Urban Decay and KVD. Now we've got bright colors from high-end brands, from middle brands. We got bright colors from affordable brands. I always say if you want to try out a color, you get one of them ColourPop monochromatic ones, because I absolutely love that shiz. Wearing a lot of that on my eyes today. So while personally I don't necessarily understand the discontinuation of the electric palette, I have a lot of fond memories with that palette. That might be why I'm so salty about it being discontinued, because it was a great palette. And it's kind of like that thing. I mean, oh wow, I was like, the Urban Decay, I was about to be like, well, this isn't the first time Urban Decay. We might as well talk about the next, which are the Urban Decay Naked palettes, which I will admit, I will hang my hat up with these palettes still being the absolute favorites for a lot of neutral, basic eyeshadow lovers. I'm not saying basic in the sense of like, oh, you're so basic. I'm saying basic in the sense of the makeup that you like to do isn't necessarily having green all up on your shiz. And so, kind of in the same vein as the electric palette, we had the original Urban Decay Naked, because at the time it was groundbreaking and earth-shattering, I guess. And then they decided to discontinue their first one, and they were like, all right, we discontinued the first one. And they didn't officially say with the Wired palette either, that these palettes were going to be the replacement or the placeholder for these palettes now that they were discontinued. But they discontinued it, and then they promptly came out with the Naked Reloaded, which was a far cry from the beautiful, groundbreaking color story that the original Naked was. There was just kind of a not enough, because I feel like when you start with a palette as groundbreaking, as standout as the electric palette and the Naked, which have very tried and true fans, it's been established, you know, it has a very strong lineage within the makeup community. So when you discontinue something that significant, I feel it behooves the company to then release something that is just as groundbreaking, just maybe attuned to the current climate more. Like, it was like, all right, you know, discontinue the electric palette, give us an electric 2.0. You know, give us the exact same thing, just different, vivid Urban Decay colors. I would have bought that shiz. You know, and with the Naked Reloaded, it's like, all right, you gave us like a softer, pastier, taupier version of the first one. As much as I'm not a fan of the matte to shimmer ratio on the first Urban Decay, honestly, on the first 3, maybe even 4, I would say that the first one had a whole heck of a lot more depth, a whole heck of a lot more going for it than the pasty with a kind of rosy reddy shade thrown in. And if you like that color story, I would recommend the Anastasia Beverly Hills, what was it? My mind is absolutely blanking. I will leave the name of it right here. If you like that, whatever, go get this one, because this one had even more depth and whatever in it, and it did the color story better than Urban Decay did. So while with, I feel, a lot of these palettes, I can understand the natural passing of time. You know, you've been around a while. You know, like I said, I don't hold the documents on their sales, whatever the decision was, we're not making enough units to do this. But if you're going to discontinue something and you're going to not intentionally replace it with a new palette, I think they could have done a bit more than supplying us with the Wired palette and the Naked Reloaded. I would have just assumed like the Naked Reloaded would have been like the first Naked, but like jacked to Jesus, like that thing would have been like, they're like, all right, we're going to give you, I don't know, 18 shades instead of whatever we give. And it's going to be an even beautiful depth and dark and decadent. And it was pasty, taupey, very sad. We might as well talk about one that at one point was pretty ding-dang high on my list. I was never a huge fan of the Naked palettes. I probably professed that I was like, they're the best things ever. Because at one point I was kind of brainwashed by the whole YouTube hype situation. But one neutral palette that I really enjoyed was the KVD Shade Light eyeshadow palette. I remember the first time I got that shiz in my hot little hands, I went into the bathroom and no blending. I shudder to look back on what it looked like, but I just took that shadow and I did it all up to my brows and all around, and I did this like, I don't know, The Grudge meets The Cure sort of grungy trad goth look. At the moment I was living for it. I don't think Soraya of now would. I couldn't even tell you how I achieved what I achieved, but I was down with this palette and I loved it for a very long time. And now we do have to take into consideration with this palette, there is the whole kind of KVD's brand going out the window, which kind of just affected the overall value of her products on a whole. You know, people weren't buying her stuff anymore. I feel as people get disenchanted with a brand, and I think this is kind of telling. I don't know if it has any relevance. This is hypothetical, but I have found that when people when a large group of people in the community become more disillusioned with a particular brand, they are then much more likely to trash the quality of said brand. While I do admit that a lot of KVD's quality did start slipping, I've noticed with people kind of bandwagging on hating other companies that they've sort of done the same thing, where they're like, well, their stuff is really bad. I'm like, but you liked it 2 weeks ago. What happened? I feel that kind of falls into the subject of brand loyalty. When we like a brand, we're maybe a little bit more willing to give them some leeway when it comes to the consistent quality of their products. Whereas when we've decided to boycott and dislike and don't like, it's free range to say whatever the flip we want. I say whatever the flip I want, whenever the flip I want, because I'm never going to get any sponsorships and I've made peace with that. So I might as well say what I feel and think. So you did have that sort of taken into consideration. And now, once again, with a lot of these palettes, in my personal mind, and I know one of y'all have, I couldn't say who the name of the person was, stated that I tend to, when I do these kind of talky videos, I tend to come from my particular standpoint, which is someone who has a butt ton of eyeshadows, somebody who really likes crazy vivid color, that when I'm coming from my perspective as an eyeshadow consumer, I'm not taking into consideration or realizing the people who are coming into this for the first time, looking for their first eyeshadow palette, people who like more simple, more basic, more neutral colors. You know, I'm not really thinking about them. And I think there is some truth to that. We do tend to sort of, I feel, project ourselves onto our content because I'm coming from my personal opinions and my experience. So I want to acknowledge that I do understand and I do know that there are people out there who are not choosing and purchasing makeup with my specifications in mind. So clearly, when it comes to the more neutral palettes, the more basic whatevers, you know, there is obviously a market for that. That's why it was a thing for so long. But with that being said, I do feel like now there is so much more turnover. There are so many more alternatives and options that those palettes that used to be these huge, significant staples just don't hold the same value that they once did within the community, within the market even, because there's always a palette that you can get and try. There's always something new. There are less permanent palettes being put out yearly than there are limited edition ones. There are a few brands that do produce a lot less limited edition products. I'm very happy that Milk Cosmetics does a fair amount of permanent products, but on a whole anymore, you're getting a new palette in Sephora, in Ulta, at least once a month, if not more, from different varying brands, high-end, drugstore, indie, whatever you want. And so brands are even less focused on creating those main staple palettes for that kind of customer anymore. You know, there's a lot of this push to just create a bunch of different things, and not every brand does that. Lorac has been staying in its lane. Tarte has been mostly staying in its lane, though sometimes they're just kind of in it. And so when you look at a palette like the KVD Shade Light palette, I love the idea of it. I've thought about buying, no wait, I decluttered mine. It was old, I don't know, but I like the idea of shading and contouring and doing all your whatevers with your face and your eyes and everything. You know, I was a convention goer, I was a cosplayer. That whole thing appealed to me. Plus, it was a variety of shades that worked really well together where you could do a nice simple look to something really, really edgy, dark, and smoky. So it was sort of this like all matte palette, do everything situation. And it had its time. A lot of people really enjoyed it. But like I said, there's just, it was like, okay, all right, KVD did this like all matte, amazing neutral to smoky eye. And I'm like, okay, if you want to get an all matte, amazing neutral to smoky eye, you got ColourPop. We know a lot more about indie brands than we did then, I feel. At least I do. You know, we've got all these different brands that are just creating so much more content that a lot of the mainstream OG staples, they're kind of there. They serve their purpose for being something that's in a comfort zone, that's like being well known for people. You know, you hear about the Tarte lip palettes, Urban Decay Naked palettes, Too Faced chocolate bar palettes. You know, those are the palettes that I think of when I think of those palettes that I needed to have back when I started my channel. And I kind of find that maybe it's just me. I don't watch a huge amount of beauty content, but I find that not as many people even talk about them anymore. Like I said, you've got the whole issue with people boycotting KVD. She has left, and people still don't buy from it. But then you also have the utilitarian point of it, where just, like I said, other things have come out. Other things will keep coming out. It's less about, you know, it used to be we had the permanent products that we talked about, and occasionally we'd talk about a limited edition release, whereas now 75% of the makeup released on a daily basis is limited edition. And so it's like this, you know, if there's a palette that you're like, oh yeah, this is the best, this is the amazing thing ever, you know, it doesn't have that extended period of time within the timeline of the makeup releases, whereas like a permanent product would. It's like, oh boy, this is amazing. Then next month, we're on to the next amazing hot shiz thing. And speaking of limited edition, let's talk about a series of limited edition palettes that people used to want and that used to be a thing. This was sort of a hallmark of my entrance into the YouTube beauty sphere. I'm gonna go back to Urban Decay. I feel like Urban Decay is just a beautiful monolithic example of makeup brands of the past. I just look at it and I see you are just such a significant OG, and recently you've just not been doing the best. Like I look at them and I think of what they used to be, what sort of feelings I used to have toward the company. Whereas now I'm like, you haven't released something I've been interested in over a year and a half. But let's talk about something that I used to have and that I loved. The Urban Decay Vice palettes. Now I missed out on the #1, but I went to every release for the 2, the 3, and the Reloaded, I believe. And after that, they stopped doing them. And I was thinking back to them and I was like, you know, I loved those palettes. I loved them for just the Vice palettes. You know, they were the ones where Urban Decay, they released them once a year, and Urban Decay would go balls to the walls and just say, let's take whatever colors we think and put them in this thing. And color loving, just all out crazy makeup person Soraya absolutely loved that shit. I hadn't developed my love for matte, so I was like, colorful shimmers, give it to me. So I had all of them, and they were just these big, giant, disjointed collections of color that would make Soraya of today make my head explode. They released the Vice palettes back then that they did today, although they did start getting the 2 and the 3 were really freaking good. Those, I used the shiz out of some of those shades. But then they started getting a lot more disjointed, and if they were to come out with those Vice palettes today, I would be like, you stupid. Because I feel like sort of what made those palettes kind of drop off in popularity is one thing I've noticed, at least in the community that I reside in here on YouTube. We're less interested in those big, giant kerfuffle of colors over palettes. We're done with just the excessive amount of randomness. Like, yeah, it used to be like, oh, we're so cool and edgy and rebellious. Here's a green, here's a blue, here's a pink, here's a black. You know, and it was sort of a thing. It was an aesthetic. It was a theme. Whereas now, as consumers, we're much more interested in something that's thought out, something that's curated, something that has a sensible matte to shimmer ratio. We want something that makes the experience of applying the pigments to our face enjoyable and easier. We want it to be inspiring. We don't want it to be headache inducing. So it's not just the Urban Decay crazy jumbled kerfuffle palettes. KVD also, I believe, started to suffer from it. Used to be, oh yeah, she just put all these colors in it and it's amazing and it's something that companies don't do. And then we got to the point where like, okay, all right, it's a KVD palette. She's putting a bunch of colors in it, and they were disjointed, not thought out. There wasn't really a color story, a color theory. It was just a bunch of fizz stuffed in a palette. So I do feel like that the Vice palettes were most definitely products of their times. You know, we've just sort of moved on from, you know, and it's not just Urban Decay and other brands I've seen from, like I said, the creators that I watch and listen to, when these big, giant, jumbled, just vomit of colors palettes comes out. It's just like, can you guys take a moment and think? Are you so uninspired that you need to just throw everything in here and call that inspiring? I appreciate a company that takes time to actually curate something that's unique and interesting than taking kind of a color story and throwing some really awesome bright colors in there. Take those single bright colors and build a color story from that. Don't just throw them in with a bunch of other random shiz. And like I said, I used to love the Vice palettes. If I could have gotten some of the shades in the Vice palettes in singles and they weren't $18, $21, I probably would. But on a whole, they're just something that I feel didn't age well. It's sort of, I don't want to say generational thing because a beauty generation is like a year, but it was sort of this like, you know, generational end of an era. We went from having and wanting all these bright, disjointed color stories to wanting something smaller, wanting something curated, and wanting it to be thought out rather than just vomited into a palette. So even though I really love them and really enjoyed them, like I said, today, if they were to release them today, I'd be like, Urban Decay doesn't have a formula that I absolutely love. This is absolutely disjointed. There are two mattes down in the corner over there that don't even make any sense with the bright colors they've provided. There's a crap ton of shimmers, and God only knows what I'm supposed to do with this palette on my eyes. And maybe in my old age, I've just become very uncreative. I've become, I don't know. Because back in the day, y'all know I'd throw shimmer all up and all on this shiz. You know, this part was a shimmer, crease shade was a shimmer, everything, outer V was a shimmer. I just used shimmer left and right. I hardly ever touched mattes. So back in the day, I was down with this shiz, whereas now I'm just like I said, maybe I'm old. Maybe I'm unimaginative anymore. Because I'm sure if Butte Bean got her hands or has her hands on any of those older Vice palettes, she could do something absolutely amazing. I kind of need a gradient. I don't necessarily need to be told, but I do work very well from the light to dark idea. Sort of get the rest of my creativity with the accessorizing sort of thing. But I'm going to leave it at that. I hope that you guys enjoy that. I know I have been doing more of these talky sort of discussion, whatever kind of videos. I hope you guys are enjoying them. I am enjoying filming them. I apologize for my content and my background kind of being all over the place, but for those of you who do keep up with the Snapchat and the Twitter and all of that, you know that I am in Tennessee, helping take care of my grandmother. There's also some going back to Virginia, coming back, you know, things I guess they're a little bit unstable right now. And so sort of with the depression and with everything like that, it's just sort of this big giant, like, I don't know. We're trying to keep it together here. So content depends greatly on mood, ability to film, ability to come up with new ideas, you know, all of that. It's kind of, I love doing it. I don't want to stop doing it, but this is the first time it has become stressful. It has become something that kind of gives me anxiety. But I love it, and I hope to keep doing it for you all and for myself. So for all of y'all who've made it this far, and for all of y'all who have kept watching, who have subscribed then, who have subscribed now, thank you guys so much. I really, really do love you. All the messages I get being all like, oh, your content is amazing. It helped me do this. That is what I'll live for this content, to be able to reach out and connect with like-minded people. So I thank y'all for that. And I thank y'all so much for watching. I love you. And as always, keep it real. Mwah.